Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we're digging into something, well, kind of fascinating. It's this historical puzzle connecting ancient Jewish tradition, early Christian spirituality, and even modern Islamic practice. We're basically asking, what if the prayer life of the very first Christians was actually really structured, like a fixed daily rhythm, much more disciplined, more physical than what you might see in most churches today?
It really is a shift in perspective, isn't it? Because today, I think we often see prayer as, spontaneous, very personal, internal. But the sources, they show something different. For centuries, the standard for, every believer was anchored in specific times throughout the day, and often involving pretty intense physical movement.
Right. And that's our mission today, isn't it? To unpack that historical evidence. We want to get a handle on what this daily structure looked like, why it was so central back then. And I guess the big question, why did it mostly disappear from the life of the average person? We've pulled together sources, New Testament accounts, early church manuals like the Didash, which is incredibly important here, and historical analyses looking at how this practice changed over time, from like the norm to something specialized.
Exactly. And maybe the best place to start is right at the foundation, the shared roots. Because what's really striking is this common DNA across the Abrahamic faiths when it comes to prayer. You look at early Jewish practice, the New Testament church, modern Muslim Salah. You see these echoes, fixed times, certain ritual structures, and a very physical kind of reverence.
Okay, the physicality first. Let's unpack that, because I think many people assume early Christian prayer was just, standing quietly, maybe hands raised, that kind of thing. But the sources suggest something much more embodied. What was the idea behind that physical reverence?
Well, it wasn't just cultural habit, I think. It seems to have been a deliberate physical acknowledgement of God's majesty. You have to remember, Christianity grew out of Judaism, and traditions like the Amida prayer already involved structured standing, bowing, reverence. So that the idea that your posture signals humility, submission, that was, fundamental.
And we can still see echoes today. You mentioned Salah, the movements in Muslim prayer standing, the deep bow, ruku, prostration, sujood, sitting. Are those really linked back through this ancient line?
Oh, absolutely. The similarity is striking because they come from that same ancient Near Eastern cultural and spiritual world. And the New Testament itself, it confirms that this kind of intense physical expression was right there at the heart of early Christian devotion. I mean, take the most extreme posture, prostration. We see Jesus himself doing this in Gethsemane. Matthew's gospel says he fell on his face.
Falling on his face. Wow, that's not just kneeling, that's total submission.
It's the ultimate gesture, isn't it? Complete humility. And the sources also show kneeling was just routine. Luke tells us Jesus knelt. Paul is often shown kneeling for communal prayer, like in Acts 20. But what really drives home how, rigorous this was is a specific detail you find in historical accounts. Early Christians often used prayer mats or rugs.
Prayer rugs, like we see today.
Exactly. Very much like in the Coptic tradition still. And the reason was simple practicality. If you're kneeling or fully prostrating on the ground multiple times a day, you need to keep clean. It tells you this wasn't an occasional thing. It was a physical, daily, maybe even messy commitment.
That detail about the rug, it really paints a picture. It speaks volumes about the frequency, the deliberateness of it all. Okay, so moving from the body to the clock, let's talk time structure, because this is where it gets really interesting, I think. The New Testament seems to treat scheduled prayer not as like extra credit, but as the expected routine.
Yeah, and you have to see it anchored in the Old Testament first. Jewish life was already structured this way. Think of Daniel praying 3 times daily, kneeling towards Jerusalem. That's Daniel 6.10. Or Psalm 55, setting that rhythm. Evening and morning and at noon. And then for the really devout, Psalm 119, 7 times a day I praise you.
So the apostles, the early Jewish Christians, they weren't inventing this schedule out of thin air. They were stepping into a pattern that was already deeply respected, woven into daily life.
Precisely. And the key times we see popping up in the New Testament are directly tied to the Jewish temple sacrifice schedule. The main hours for public worship, Acts, the book of Acts, is just crucial for seeing this in action.
Right, let's hit the big ones. Peter and John go into the temple.
At a specific time, the 9th hour. That's about 3 p.m. Acts 3.1 says they went at the hour of prayer, the 9th hour. It lined up with the evening sacrifice. It wasn't just, let's pop by the temple. It was scheduled, mandatory almost. And you see it extending beyond just Jewish folks right away. Remember Cornelius, the Roman centurion. In Acts 10, he says he was praying at home at the 9th hour when the angel appeared.
Okay, and the other times, noon and morning.
Yep, the 6th hour, noon. That was the midday offering time, and Peter was praying on a rooftop about the 6th hour in Acts 10 when he had that crucial vision about welcoming Gentiles.
Yeah.
And the 3rd hour, 9 a.m., linked to the morning sacrifice. Acts 2 references this as the time the Pentecost miracle happened. People thought they were drunk, but Peter says it's only the 3rd hour of the day.
Yeah.
So the 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., they were the undeniable anchors for that first generation of Christians.
Okay, so the practice existed, clearly rooted in Jewish tradition. But as the church started forming its own identity, spreading out into the Gentile world, how did they formalize this? How did they keep the structure without relying only on the temple schedule, which wasn't relevant to Gentiles?
Right, that's a key transition, moving from shared Jewish practice to something distinctly Christian. And the core structure that became standard for all believers is centered on the Lord's Prayer.
The sources mention praying the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day, specifically replacing the Jewish Amidah prayer. Why that specific replacement? What was the point?
Well, it seems to have been a very conscious act of defining their new identity in Christ. The Amidah, the 18 blessings, was the absolute centerpiece of Jewish daily prayer. It affirmed their covenant, their hopes. So by telling Christians, okay, you pray the prayer Jesus gave you 3 times a day, these early church guides were setting up a new, distinctly Christian liturgical marker. The Didache, which is just incredibly early, maybe 80, 60 to 100, explicitly says, pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. It directly reinforces that 3rd, 6th, and 9th hour rhythm, but now for everyone, Jew or Gentile.
So the Didache wasn't just suggesting it. It was basically providing the daily spiritual schedule for Gentile believers.
Exactly right. It ensured that no matter your background, you shared this common unified rhythm, anchored you back to Christ's own words throughout the day.
But then things got even more intense for some, right? The monks, the desert communities, this 3 times a day thing expanded dramatically.
It did. It reflects this deepening desire for, well, constant connection, a more intentional discipline. You see leaders like Hippolytus, writing around AD 215 in his apostolic tradition, formally laying out a cycle of 7 distinct prayer times. This included waking up, the 3rd hour, 6th, 9th, evening when the lamps were lit, bedtime, and even midnight.
7 times. That's a huge commitment. Was there a specific reason for 7 beyond just fulfilling that Psalm 119 verse?
Well, fulfilling the psalm was part of it, definitely, but it was also seen as a way to sanctify every part of the day and night. They connected these hours to specific moments in Christ's passion. So midnight prayer might recall his arrest in the garden. The 9th hour, obviously, is death on the cross. The prayers weren't just asking for stuff. They were this continuous act of remembering and participating in that story.
And it's crucial to understand the purpose here, right? These structures, whether 3 times or 7, they weren't meant to be legalistic boxes to check.
Not at all, according to the sources. They were seen as the necessary framework, the trellis, if you like, for that bigger spiritual goal in 1 Thessalonians 5.17. Pray without ceasing.
Yeah.
The idea was you can't just will yourself into a state of constant prayer. You need anchors. These fixed times train the mind, discipline the body, so that awareness of God became, hopefully, the default state, not something you had to force periodically.
Okay, this brings us to the big question then. If this structured daily prayer 3 times, maybe 7, was the bedrock of Christian life for centuries, practiced by the apostles, written into the earliest manuals, kept alive by monks, why did it largely vanish from the daily life of the average person? Why did most Christians just stop praying at fixed hours?
Yeah, this is where we see Christianity adapting, maybe even compromising as it shifted. From this small, very disciplined group to a massive, dominant cultural religion. There are really 4 big overlapping reasons why this daily practice eroded.
Okay, let's take them one by one. The first one sounds like a cultural shift, moving away from its origins.
Exactly, the gentilization of the church. As Christianity exploded across the Roman Empire, you had millions of new converts, Greeks, Romans, Gauls, Celts. They just didn't have that deeply ingrained Jewish cultural habit of stopping everything multiple times a day for formal prayer. The cultural muscle memory wasn't there. It was much easier for them to focus on the big Sunday gathering and maybe private, spontaneous prayer. So that daily structure, it kind of became the first casualty of mass conversion, you could say.
Sounds almost like a failure to instill that core discipline in new believers. But surely the structure survives somewhere within the church, with the leaders.
It did, but it became specialized. That's the second major factor, the rise of monasticism and specialization. Once Christianity became established, even the state religion, the pressure changed. That intense 7 times a day cycle was perfectly preserved, but primarily by monks, nuns, and clergy, usually within monasteries. It became known as the Opus Dei, literally, the work of God.
Opus Dei, the work. So what used to be the standard daily discipline for, I don't know, a baker or a soldier in the early church, it became the professional job of the clergy. That's a massive shift.
It essentially created a system of, well, spiritual outsourcing. The expectation subtly flipped. The ordinary folks, the laity, they'd support the monastery financially or materially, and the monks and nuns would do the heavy lifting of praying the hours on behalf of everyone else. So the rigor was kept alive, but its universality was lost. The deep dive became the domain of specialists.
And then, much later, the Reformation hits. I imagine that sent shockwaves through any kind of preset ritual.
Oh, absolutely. The Protestant Reformation is the third huge catalyst here. The Reformers were reacting against what they saw as works-based religion, earning salvation through rituals, and perceived corruption. So things like fixed prayer times, prescribed liturgies, repetitive cycles, they viewed all that with deep suspicion.
Why? What was the fear? How does praying at 9 a.m. become seen as works-based or problematic?
The core concern was sincerity. They worried that if you had to stop and pray at 9, 12, and 3, you might start thinking the act itself, just checking the box, was what pleased God, even if your heart wasn't really in it. They emphasized soulified, faith alone, and pushed for prayer that was spontaneous, heartfelt, rising directly from a personal relationship. They saw the ancient hours as potentially spiritually deadening formalism, maybe even dangerous. And this effectively dismantled that daily fixed structure for huge parts of the Christian world.
Wow. So we went from structure enabling spontaneous prayer to structure being seen as the enemy of spontaneous prayer.
That sums up the theological divide pretty well. And then finally, the fourth factor wasn't religious at all. It was societal, the Industrial Revolution. Think about it. Before the 18th, 19th centuries, life was mostly agrarian or based on small crafts. There was usually flexibility. A farmer, a blacksmith, they could probably take breaks.
But the factory whistle changed all that.
Completely. Industrialization demanded rigid schedules, continuous labor, dictated by the clock. Stopping the production line for group prayer at 9, noon, and 3. Impossible. Economically disastrous from the factory owner's perspective, the whole rhythm of modern work just clashed violently with those ancient spiritual rhythms. Plus, rising individualism meant people shifted towards private Bible reading or devotional books at home rather than communal scheduled prayer. So you have the Reformation's theology combined with industrialization's economics. And that pretty much removed the fixed hours from the daily life of most believers.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what does it all mean for us, for you listening? I think the takeaway is pretty clear. Early Christian devotion was deeply rooted in this structured, physical, daily rhythm. It's a world away from the mostly spontaneous forms common today, and it really highlights how Christianity transformed from that disciplined minority faith into a broader, sometimes more cultural religion where that intense rigor became, well, specialized.
And you now have that historical context.
Yeah.
You can trace these threads of fixed-hour prayer back through the Abrahamic tradition, and you can understand how these huge historical forces, theological debates about faith versus works, cultural shifts from Jewish roots to Gentile society, the economic shift from farms to factories, all played a part in fundamentally changing how people approach God daily.
Yeah, and that knowledge kind of forces a reflection, doesn't it? The early church saw this structure, the divine office, as the essential discipline needed to even attempt that command to pray without ceasing. So for you, the listener, maybe the question is, what simple structure, even just 3 times a day, could anchor your own unceasing pursuit? Whether it's knowledge or creativity or finishing that big project, that ancient dedication to rhythm, once a core religious practice, it's still a powerful tool we can use to discipline